Good evening, and welcome to our dangerous dialogue, Seeking Shalom, working towards a just atonement. My name is Rodney Sadler, and I'm the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation. I'd like to share a little bit about what we do here with Dangerous Dialogues, but before we begin, let's open up with a word of prayer. Holy One, it's once again that we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. We are grateful that you have given us an opportunity to come together as your people to learn about issues of justice in this world and places where we need justice. To have an occasion, Lord, to imagine what it would be like to manifest parts of your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Lord, as we gather tonight, I want to ask that you would be with our panelists and with me as we delve deeply into your sense of justice, Lord, your sense of shalom in the midst of a broken and fractured, but intentionally so, world. As we gather right now, we ask that we would always be found useful to you. Use us for your purposes. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So I'd like to welcome you again to Dangerous Dialogues. Dangerous Dialogues are a program that we began to put together several years ago when we realized that the church is struggling with a number of issues that are difficult to deal with, but often does not have an occasion to talk about. We began this dialogue wrestling with issues of Israel and Palestine. Who's right? Who's wrong? How do you adjudicate such things in the midst of a fraught situation? We also began to wrestle with other issues. We dealt with human sexual trafficking, human sexuality, homelessness. We spent our entire last year looking at. In essence, we want to make sure that the church is addressing these issues of crucial concern so that the people of God, those particularly least lost and otherwise left out, might have their needs met. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about this notion of seeking shalom. What does that mean, to seek shalom? We usually think about the word shalom in terms of notions of peace. But is there something deeper to this meaning? I've got two people I'm excited to bring before you tonight. One of them is a professor of theology at Union Presbyterian Seminary, Dr. Rachel Bard. The other is the director of our Leadership Institute at Union Seminary, Dr. Chris Burton. And these two people, I think, will have wonderfully different perspectives on this topic. Rachel, as a person who grew up in South Africa, who was there and wrestled theologically with what does it mean to end apartheid? What does it mean to bring about a more just society? Chris, as a African-American activist, an African-American scholar, an African-American consultant who's wrestled with issues of diversity and inclusion, and has come to some different opinions and different ideas about what makes for a just peace. So after what I'm going to make a brief presentation, I want to delve into a larger conversation with our two guests for this evening. Let's start off, though, with just a walk through a presentation that I began a little while ago that wrestles with some of these issues. Shalom as balance, and wrestling with race as the notion of systemic injustice. In part, I want to talk a little bit about race. And as we do so, I think we all are aware that we have a race problem in America, but I think so often we have so little idea of what it means when we talk about issues of race. We have a common understanding of what race is and what race isn't. We tend to believe that race must refer to something that's real in our society, though we may not be sure what that looks like. Well, the myth of race in our society usually is thought of as a descriptive category, premised on the color of your skin, your body type, your facial features, your hair texture. It's believed that these descriptive features are, in essence, an exterior presentation of what race is, but that race also has internal features as well. Things like intelligence, ability, behavior, moral character, criminality, sexuality are defined by race. We believe that these stereotypes are somehow or another accurate reflections of what different races of people are really like. As we begin the conversation, I want to simply say that race is nothing. The concept of race has no essential validity. Ontologically, we're all of the same essence. We're all of the same being. We all come from the same types of essential essence. We eat the same types of food, live in the same types of environment. We fundamentally can survive wherever because we are of the same essential type. Biologically, we are the same species. There is no difference, color of your skin. We can all come together across what we think about racial lines and make children. If a lion and tiger get together, they make a liger that can't reproduce. A horse and a donkey get together, they make a mule that can't reproduce. But human beings of any color, any type, can reproduce living, vital organisms that reproduce themselves. Genetically, we found that there's more genetic variation between two groups of gorillas on one African mountain than there is between every human being on the planet. We have not existed long enough to justify subspecies variation amongst human beings. There, in essence, is no scientific basis for the assumption of race. That says race is something. It seems to impact different details like our life expectancy, how long we can live, our health outcomes, what we expect to be, how we expect to live in this world. Our educational attainment is often described quite accurately by our racial identity. Our employability, African Americans tend to have twice the rate of unemployment in society as their white counterparts. We can predict that fairly accurately. Wealth, we can predict fairly accurately. African Americans tend to have 1/10 the amount of wealth of their white counterparts. Unfortunately, incarceration rates are also quite predictive. African Americans, 1 in 3 born since 2000, will likely spend some time incarcerated. 1 in 9 currently exists under the supervision of the criminal justice system. There's something going on along racial lines that make us think that race really is something. But what it is a dangerous social construct, something that we made up and something that we live into. But because we made it, it's also something that we have the power to unmake. Race is not what we might assume it to be, descriptive. It's actually prescriptive. It's not an attempt to understand who people are, but it's actually an attempt to determine who we will allow them to be, how we'll treat them. It's not real scientifically, ontologically, biologically, genetically, but it is a societal agreement that determines a hierarchical pecking order. Race isn't a scientific description of who God made us to be, but it is a societal prescription of what is socially acceptable for whoever you might be in this world. What can you do or can't you do? In essence, race evolves as a legitimating ideology roughly about the time of the Enlightenment, which coincides with the time of colonization. It became a way of Europeans, good European Christians, to colonize the world without a fear of doing something wrong. It authorized good Christian people to take lands from other peoples and people from others' lands. It provided moral cover for theft, kidnapping, murder, and other crimes against humanity, against God. Race was the reason that was given for conveying wealth, power, and privilege on those who imagined themselves to be white by taking things from those who they told were Black. In essence, I want to suggest today that race is the establishment of systemic imbalance. This is the outcome of a racialized system. This is done in part by creating polarized thinking, assuming that there are two poles of humanity. Those who imagine themselves to be white were made by God as good and pure and brilliant and superior, and God wanted them to govern those who did not have the benefits of whiteness, while those who were deemed Black were made by God as immoral, impure, and unintelligent, therefore inferior. They were made by God to be governed by others. One group was given the responsibility of attending to the needs, details, and lives of others. I like to use some examples of what this looks like, and I'll just read a little bit from this. When Josiah Priest, a Northern Presbyterian Reform minister, talked about the curse of Ham in Genesis chapter 9, and what he believed this attributed Blackness to Ham and to his descendants. He said that Ham was exceedingly prone to acts of ferocity, cruelty involving murder, war, butcheries, and even cannibalism, including beastly lust and lasciviousness in its worst feature, going beyond the force of these passions as possessed in common by the other races of men. The word signifies deceit, dishonesty, treachery, low-mindedness, and malice. What a group of horrors are here, couched in the word Ham, all agreeing in the most surprising manner with the color of Ham's skin, as well as that with his real character as a man during his own life, as well as with that of his race, even now. Let that sink in. A theology was used to justify this racial division, to support a hierarchy of humanity, to perpetuate imbalance. I want to give you one more example, and this one is particularly important because this man held the same position that my colleague Rachel holds. Robert Louis Dabney, systematic theology professor here at Union Seminary, but maybe given a couple hundred years ago. Robert Dabney, writing about Ham, says that the curse of Ham, he says, God's sentence here pronounced on Ham by Noah was based on his foresight of the fact that Ham's posterity, i.e. Blacks, would be like their father, would be peculiarly degraded in morals, as actual history testifies of them, so far as its voice extend. The words of Noah are not mere prophecy, they are a verdict, a moral sentence pronounced upon conduct by competent authority, not the drunk Noah with the hangover, that verdict sanctioned by God. Let that sink in. This is a professor of theology espousing these ideas. In essence, this supported a mythology of inferiority. My former colleague, Dr. Katie Cannon, in her book, Katie's Canon, suggests to justify their enslavement, Black people had to be completely stripped of every privilege of humanity. Their dignity and value as human beings born with natural rights had to be denied. Black Americans were divorced so far as possible of all intellectual, cultural, and moral attributes. They had no socially recognized personhood. The institution of chattel slavery and its corollary, white supremacy and racial bigotry, excluded Black people from every normal human consideration. The humanity of Black people had to be denied, for the evil of the slave system, or the evil of the slave system, would be evident. So in essence, race authorized an imbalance, a binary imbalance, good versus bad, white versus Black, master versus servant, superior versus inferior, white over Black. In America, this becomes particularly pernicious. The American supremacist system is predicated on the perpetuation of this notion of imbalance. This imbalance fosters intentional inequality. So our system today is not broken. It's working just as it was intended to work. When we see people suffering in ghettos, when we see people living under bridges, mostly Black and brown people who are homeless, when we see schools failing our children, it is not that this is some mistake by happenstance. These are the results of systemic choices that have been made along the way that we have to look at, an intentional imbalance that's created. In this regard, there can be no such thing as racial injustice, as the concept of race has the notion of imbalance inherently tied to its core. I want to give us an example of a passage that gets to a point of a theological premise about what should happen in imbalanced situations. Leviticus chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. Says, when you have sinned and realize your guilt and would restore what you took by robbery or by fraud or by the dispossession of something that was committed to you, or the loss of a thing that was found, or anything else about which you sworn falsely, you shall repay the principal amount and shall add 1/5 to it. You shall pay it to its owner when you realize your guilt. As we look at this notion, we see several terms that deal with the notion of atonement here. The term shuv, returning what had been taken. The term shalem, providing restitution for what was done that was wrong. Kafer, to cover over that sin and that wrongdoing by making it right. This is all covered in the English term at one-ment, a made-up term that means to make a state of being back to being at one. So shalom, as restored balance, is what we are talking about today. The Hebrew term for that's used for restitution is the term shalom. Shalom is not just peace, as in peace from war, not just non-aggression, not just silence, but shalom is about producing wholeness, providing balance when things have been disrupted in the world. I love that statement that's made that we don't often understand. We usually say, no justice, no peace in the midst of these Black Lives Matter protests. And we usually think that it means, if you don't give me justice, I ain't going to give you peace. But the fundamental point of this is, if you don't provide tzedek, right relationships, then there can be no shalom. There is never the balance restored in society. So as we deal with issues of racial imbalance in America, one of the things I want to say is, we often talk so easily about notions of privilege, white privilege, and we talk about it as though it's just some sort of happenstantial thing, but we should recognize that there is no such thing as privilege without attendant underprivilege. There can be no advantage unless someone in the system has been disadvantaged. White privilege costs someone something. That privilege often comes at the expense of Black and brown people who've been forced to live in a system at disadvantage to make it happen. I usually tell the story about my daughter. When I used to take her to school in high school, there were two lanes, one that went in and one that went out. And we'd have to get in this long line to go into school. Inevitably, people would get tired and they would try to drive into the oncoming traffic lane when no cars were coming out. But inevitably a car would come out and stop them. And when it did, they'd have to pull in the line in front. As they pulled forward and got advantage, it disadvantaged everybody else that was in line. And this is the way that privilege and advantage work in our society as well. If we're to have a just society, we have to find a way to move beyond notions of privileging some at the expense of others. In essence, yes, the American policies of imbalance have cost people, BIPOC people, dearly. We often think about America as a great nation and think about its ability to thrive and to prosper. And we say that it's premised upon the fact that we have great ideas, that we have a nation that was premised on an idea, not just on a peoplehood, and that because of this we are great, that we developed and have great minds. Because of this we are great. But we don't realize that in part the greatness of America came from the fact that we had free land stolen from indigenous American Indians, labor stolen from African Americans through slavery, convict leasing, Jim Crow, segregationist policies, a people from China forced to make the railroads that we depended upon for our commerce. So many peoples were abused to provide privilege to others. American advantage did cost someone something. It has not been free. As we seek to repair the breach, we should look at the history of Israel. As a professor of Old Testament, I want to look at Israel in the Bible. In the aftermath of the Exodus, there was the opportunity for people to be restored as they left the Exodus. They were able to, quote unquote, plunder their Egyptian neighbors. When leaving Babylon after the exile, Babylon compensated the people for what they went through, and the neighbors of the people who lived in Babylon gave them resources so that they could go back and reestablish Jerusalem and the temple. Even after Israel, the Jewish people went through the Shoah in Germany, the German people began to compensate them for this. God's vision for restoring balance often involves a mode of seeking shalom, some form of reparations. And I want to ask, do we need that kind of atonement in our nation today? William Darity and Dr. Mullen suggest in their book, reparations are a program of acknowledgement and redress for grievous injustice. Where African Americans are concerned, grievous injustices that make the case for reparations include slavery, legal segregation, Jim Crow, and ongoing discrimination and stigmatization. In essence, we see that we have met the bar and the need for some sense of just atonement in our nation today. So we need to examine how race impacts all of our systems in our society. We need to reimagine these systems and figure out what they would look like if they were just. And we need to work to make a more just America a reality. It is only once we begin to do this that the notion of shalom is possible. I want to just lift up a couple of more quotes here, and I won't read these through in the interest of time. But Isabella Wilkerson's notion that we as Americans have talked about this notion of equality, but rarely lived up to it. And as we see other people from outside have recognized that we did not live up to the fact that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. Ta-Nehisi Coates suggests that all of us as Americans need to work towards atonement if we are to be the kind of America that we believe we should be. And Darity and Mullen suggests that if we never stand up and make the restitution we need to Black and brown people, we are hurting ourselves as a nation. It is a missed opportunity to make us who we need to be. Jamar Tisby also talks about in The Color of Compromise the fact that it's not just America that needs to atone, but the Christian church in particular, that we need to begin to work towards just atonement as faith community if we are to be the church that Christ has called us to be. I'll end with this one. This much is clear. The American church has compromised about racism. Countless Christians have ignored, obscured, or misunderstood this history, but the excuses are gone. The information cannot be hidden. The only question that remains is what the church will do now that its complicity in racism has been exposed. That's a lot in a brief period of time, but I wanted to establish the background of why it is I think that we need to move towards a seeking of shalom, a restoration of balance as a nation and as a church, if we are to deal with the gross injustices of racialization in America today. Let me start by introducing my panelists and having them share a few minutes about who they are and some of the work that they've done. My first panelist is, again, Dr. Rachel Espard, Assistant Professor of Theology and Ethics and the Director of the Master of Arts in Public Theology program. So proud of what that program is and how you pulled that process together. Please tell me a little bit about your experiences living in a society that was struggling with the aftermath of apartheid. What was your assessment of their success in restoring balance as a nation riddled with intentional racialized injustice?
That's a big question. Let me start by saying thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to talk about this. And as you were talking just now, I've heard most of what you just talked about before, and each time it remains shocking to me. When I first arrived in the United States in the late 1990s, to start my PhD program, I thought, well, now I'm going to see how people do this, how people, live together harmoniously in a post-racial society, whatever kind of cliche ideas I had in my head. Nothing could have been further from the truth. It was an eye-opener. It was shocking to me, coming from a country which is probably one of the most divided nations in the world. In terms of my own experiences was that of a teenager in the 1980s, which was a time of great turmoil and change and unrest in South Africa that shaped my consciousness. It shaped my own understanding of race and the importance of issues of justice when it comes to faith. As a person of faith from a young age onwards, I recognize that you cannot have faith without a focus on justice. You cannot say that you love your neighbor as yourself and then you believe in apartheid or anything of that sort. I was involved in the last all-white elections in South Africa and in the first democratic elections in South Africa. And it was an interesting time of transition. I standing in line with a black friend on the day in April 27th, 1994, where I was voting for the second time in my life and he was voting for the first time. And there was a great sense of hope. Nelson Mandela became president. There was a sense of optimism among most people in South Africa, including most whites, not all whites. There were some who were very nervous, but it was generally a sense of, at last, this is over. But of course, the next day dawns, and then you have to deal with issues around infrastructure and government and all of that. So I would say that the history of South Africa since then has been a bit of a mixed bag for all kinds of complicated reasons. The Asian Commission, which met in the years following apartheid, focused on bringing forth people who had done bad things during the apartheid years, partly because they wanted to be able to basically find the bodies, quite literally in some cases, and try to bring peace and healing to the land. And this was based to a large extent in the vision of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, whose belief in the concept of Ubuntu, which I can say about a little bit more later, because I just recently wrote about that, that really shaped that process. But the part of that process that was never really realized was reparations. And I would not say that's the sum total of some of the problems that followed, but you cannot have the exploitation of people for a very long time and then just say, well, now we're going to sit back and relax and hang out. It doesn't work like that. So the actual hard work of transformation, yes, they did quite a bit on that. There's still a lot of work to be done.
Thank you so much for wrestling with that. And it was intriguing to hear you talk about what does America look like as someone coming from a society. We're often held up as the ideal. We are lifted up as this exceptional notion that, oh, well, we've got it right, and come here and see how we do it.
You managed to shock a white South African who has seen quite a bit.
That line will linger with me for some time. So if I were to think about this here, what would it look like? What would it look like if we were able to truly get, you can start off with the context of South Africa. What would it look like? What type of injustices do you see that persist in the aftermath, even of the Truth and Reconciliation process? Is it economic primarily? Is it power imbalances? What are the major imbalances that we see that we need to address?
That is a very hefty question. Economics, definitely. I mean, as you rightly noted, the concept of race itself and racism in general is grounded in economics, right? It was created in the interest of enriching some at the expense of others. How to fix that? I'm not always sure how we do that, because it's not as easy as saying, well, let's write a few checks here and there. I mean, we really need to do very intensive work on restructuring society. It's not just a matter of, dishing out a few bucks here and there. So how do you restructure society and at the same time keep the economy growing? So those are really hard questions. And I think I can see South Africa really struggling with that. Then the issue of reconciliation. So I was writing recently on the Confession of Belhar, which is one of the three major responses in theology to the apartheid system. There are three major ones. The one is liberation theology, which you find in the Kairos document. The other one, which is, liberation theology would be directly confrontational, prophetic, activist, all of that. Then you get the Ubuntu theology of someone like Desmond Tutu, where the focus is on the imago Dei of human beings, on the connectedness of humans, which I find a very interesting perspective, because it recognizes that the fundamental flaw of apartheid was its downright foolishness in thinking that you can create a society that flourishes based on building walls between people. And that is a lesson that this country also needs to learn, and that South Africa still needs to continue to learn, because we want to create walls between ourselves. And then the third major response is the confessional tradition that we find expression in the Belhar Confession, which is one of the first confessional documents, if not the first, from a church in the majority world, given as a gift back to the world church. And that is a treasure. And in it, it speaks about reconciliation, but the focus is actually not in the first place on reconciliation after apartheid, because that is often criticized as, oh, that's just cheap grace. You know, it shouldn't, you can't just simply have reconciliation. Well, first of all, it speaks about unity and justice as well, and it embeds it in a vision of God. But that reconciliation aspect is really crucial, because the problem with apartheid, among many other problems it had, but the foundational problem was that before it even started, it gave up on reconciliation. That was the essence of apartheid. So if you trace back the history. And so the hard work of actual reconciliation, when it is difficult to understand one another, when we have fundamentally different worldviews, when there is a history of pain, that is not something for the faint-hearted, but it is the only way forward, because the alternative in South Africa was apartheid. Apartheid was grounded in a sense of people wanting to be separate from one another because they couldn't figure out how to get along. So they just said, okay, let's just move to the side. So that's not a full answer, but at least hopefully a few nuggets of thought there for you.
I thank you for that. I think you've given us a lot to think about. And I think for me, you've given some significance to these notions of confession, Kairos and Belhar, and the way that they can inform us deeply theologically in a brief amount of space, brief amount of time. Thank you so much. Chris, I'd love to, Chris is the director of the Leadership Institute here. He is principal consultant with DeBattist Consultants. He is a student from long ago, and I'm so glad that you decided you wanted to come back and finish up your doctoral work here with us as well. And now that you've come back to be on staff with us, dare I say, a part of the broader faculty, as you are engaged deeply in the teaching at our institution, even teaching our faculty, and as you do things on race and things. Grateful for your presence here. Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you have done and how you got involved in this work for racial justice.
Thank you. I think when you sort of go back to what I often talk about is like that sort of that sense of the scene of the crime, and for me, I think about how it's one of those things where it was always a part of the story, and just over time I started to be able to look back and say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize what was going on in these terms that I now have, but it was always a part of the story. So for example, I think back to as early as 1992, where I'm in a Sunday school and crying in that class because everyone's talking about Rodney got beat up. And in my mind, I'm thinking about my good friend Rodney, who comes to church, who wasn't at church that particular Sunday. But of course, they were talking about Rodney King in Los Angeles. So just thinking about the ways in which these stories that happened in the greater American society and even on the world stage could bleed into childhood, and how that really does do the work of shaping someone's lens on things. So I really couldn't point it only to just one culminating factor. Definitely, if I had to, I would say that a lot of that journey really coalesced when I became a servant leader intern with the Children's Defense Fund's Freedom School program the summer after my freshman year of college, and really thought about the way in which, the sort of activism work I'd been doing in high school, and even starting to get a sense of being involved in those college days was really had to be lived out through an understanding of education. And I've even for me now, as I've married this sense of activism to my own theological journey, really understanding the great commission that Jesus has or commands his disciples, really being the sense to go out and go teach. Like, what does that mean to go be an educator? What does that mean to not just live it out, but to make sure that you're preparing people so that they can carry it on as well?
Mm-hmm. Good, good. Thank you. Tell me a little bit about this notion. When we talk about race in America, so often we talk about it in terms of relationships.
Mm-hmm.
We need to figure out how to get along. Can we
Right.
all just get along? Why is it that we don't think about the systemic issues associated with it as much? And why is it that we need to think about the systemic issues around issues of race?
You know, your question makes me think about that great song by Peter Tosh, where he says, "Everyone's crying out for peace, none are crying out for
For
justice."
justice.
You know, it's
Followers of Jesus.
yes, yes, yes. And it is so much about having it's time for another conversation. At this point in the story of America, it feels like we've got the beats down to a sweet science, right? We know something awful happens in the news. It causes us to get upset. And then we say, we need to have a dialogue. But the dialogue doesn't really get to the core of it. I think at best, the dialogue maintains a negative piece where it just allows people to sort of say, well, I've heard from you, you've heard from me. It's almost like we treat race and really the terror associated with race, the violence associated with race, in the same way that you would treat two siblings who were just having a spat over who gets to control the TV remote. Like it's so much more than that, but we've really just dumbed it down and equivocated it all the way to its most innocuous form. And it really is something far more sinister and far more ubiquitous, that it's really a part of every single part of how we do society, our part of our rhythms. And I think that so much energy has been wasted on just trying to maintain that negative piece rather than doing the really difficult work of maintaining a positive piece where not only do you have the dialogue, but the dialogue is attached to notions of repair. I think so much, as Rachel was sharing earlier, so much of the conversation stops right before you get to reparations, particularly in the American context, because you now get this sense of in some cases really feigned ignorance, in other cases people just acting in bad faith, or they act as if the benefits of enslavement weren't passed down. So when people talk about reparations, like, oh, I didn't own any slaves, but you still own the benefits. That compound interest is a real thing. And so thinking about the ways in which we can collectively interrupt it, we can collectively repair, but we've collectively lacked the will to do so.
Thank you for that. I'd like to bring Rachel back into the conversation and have a three-way conversation about this larger issue. And I've got one of the questions I just want to start off with is a simple one. Is it possible for us to move from a system that has been racialized for so long towards a greater sense of justice? Is there any hope that this can happen? I hear people talk about, oh, race is intractable. It's been with us forever, and it will always be with us. And that's usually said in much the same way as the poor will be with us always.
Yeah.
And you throw up your hands and you go on about your business. I'd love to hear you respond to that, Rachel.
So two slightly separate things. I hope I remembered both. The one is, in terms of the last question, if you look from the South African experience, you see even more clearly than what you already talked about earlier, how fake race is. Now, that doesn't mean it's not serious. When you said race is nothing, I said that's true. Evil is nothing as well in the Christian tradition. It doesn't mean that it's not freaking serious, right? Because as I always explain to my students, you can have a hole in your sweater and that hole is going to get bigger and bigger, and it's nothing. It doesn't consist of anything, but it's going to destroy your sweater. And so this nothing thing that we've cooked up is extremely destructive. But it is extremely fake. And because it's fake, it is not something that we can't change. So in South Africa, for example, the apartheid rested on 4 racial categories, and they were completely fake. I mean, most whites in South Africa have mixed race ancestry. Apartheid didn't operate with a sort of a one-drop rule or anything like that. It was a different racial construct. then the different Black groups were all very different, ethnically, linguistically. There were differences, right? There were different cultures. Then there were people from of Indian descent, and there were people of other Asian descent who were just kind of lumped together. And then there was a group of people that they didn't know what to do with, that they just lumped together in a completely fake category. And it was all, they pretended that these were groups that represented the cultural diversity of South Africa, but it didn't. It was made up, completely made up. And so, as you noted as well, it was made up. A lot of our racial constructs go back to colonialism. You can trace this in Shakespeare. If you look at some of the earlier Shakespeare texts, I mean, yes, you have Othello the Moor, and they notice that he's darker skinned, but you don't have that harsh racial construct that you would have later.
Yeah.
I mean, just as a small example. The other thing I want to say in response to what you were just saying about the getting along thing, atonement in Christian theology is a relational concept, right? Sin is a relational idea, and atonement is what is addressing sin. And so it is the restoration of relation. And this is also something that I find in Ubuntu theology in the work of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. But we need a deeper relationality than just getting along. Because getting along is something you do with acquaintances at the water fountain. And we need a deeper sense of our connectedness. And this is really where I see the African concept of Ubuntu come in, which is not just, we'll kind of hang out together and form a type of community. It is a deep sense of that my humanity and your humanity are tied up with each other. And that when we are, when that deep relationality is not restored, we all lose out. And so for me, one of the things I think that is very important is to recognize this is not a matter of winners and losers. This is a matter of saying we are all losing as a result of racial constructs. This is not to say, oh, the whites suffer just as much as the blacks. That would be a terrible thing to say. That's not what I'm suggesting. But to say that our humanity is harmed by these things. And if we want to live fully as human beings, then we need to go for a deeper relationality, a deeper atonement, a deeper sense of reconciliation, which cannot escape questions of justice and reparations and all of those structural issues.
Amen. Chris, I want to bring you in on this question, but I also want to tease you a little bit too. Rachel's concerned there about the fact that moving beyond a racialized society can benefit us all. Is that true? Would this be a benefit to all Americans, not just Black Americans? How do white people benefit from moving beyond these categorizations?
Oh no, we absolutely know that oppression oppresses oppressor and oppressed alike, right? So this is not something. It would be one thing, right? And Baldwin articulates this in my estimation best, right? It'd be one thing if we saw white supremacy provide a great deal of peace and comfort to white people, right? Like that would be one thing if that's what the results were. But we've seen in this experiment of white supremacy, in this experiment of apartheid, that people don't have peace, that people still have anxiety, they still have a holding on to this myth of scarcity, the sense that someone, some sort of boogeyman, if you will, is coming to take the things that they have. And so there absolutely would be a great benefit. I was just having this conversation earlier with a dear friend of mine in the sense of when you make these policies, and we've seen this in American history, when you make policies that are aimed toward helping out Black people in the United States, it benefits everyone, right? So, so something as simple as we think often of affirmative action as something that's for Black people, right? When the people who benefited most from affirmative action were white females, white women, right? We think about something like welfare, stereotyped as something that benefit Black people, like the whole notorious notion of the welfare queen, thinking of a Black woman in the inner city. Well, we know statistically the people who most receive welfare are white people in the United States. So just thinking about the ways in which all of these policies that people think of as like, oh, that's going to solve like the Black problem, right? Pulling on that old Du Boisian question of what does it feel like to be the problem. When we understand that it always helps everyone else, right? And it has to be something that helps everyone else. But I also want to jump on your initial question, because I think, and this is a very much a faith-filled response, but I'm convinced that wickedness has an expiration date. And so even though people talk about something like racism and white supremacy, apartheid as these things that are like, forever and ever, it's like gravity, almost like a natural law. We know these things started, right? Like we can look historically and say, this is when it started. These are the forces that brought them to start. So that tells me that if it started, it can also end. And I think that we have the responsibilities to remain hopeful. I think pessimism and things of this nature is just far too convenient and frankly even lazy to just say, like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We have to be the ones that are dramatic enough, that are daring enough to say this does have an expiration date.
I think I heard an ancestor say, trouble don't last always.
That's right. Timothy Wright, trouble don't last always, for
Trouble
sure.
don't last always. So, and you brought in the notion of faith. So I want to hit you, stick with you, Chris, for a second here and say, when we think about the racialization of America, we often think about the church as the latent solution. The church should have, the church is the place where we can begin to fix it. The church is the place that we can rectify the situation if our theology was right. To what extent was the church complicit in creating this and complacent in allowing it to exist?
That's really the tragedy in it, right? Because we'd like to think that the church was just some sort of like anemic being trying to break up the fight and saying, stop you all, like, don't do this. But we know historically that the church was part and parcel in the construction of this. We talked about Robert Louis Dabney earlier, like someone who wrote the theological justification of enslaving people, right? Like, this is not something where the church was on the sideline. But I think, if anything, the church can be the ones to model what it looks like to be honest with yourself, to be repentant, to have that deep sense of metanoia and turning your face. So going from being an active participant in what was destructive to being an active participant in what's constructive. Now, I think the trouble we're going to find ourselves in this time in space is that no longer do you have the church as the sort of like third space where people want to make sure they're coming and holding their meetings, wanting to socialize, wanting to brainstorm together. We're sort of having like a bad public relations. Maybe the chickens have come home to roost in that sort of way. But I do think that we have an opportunity to really have that sense of like modeling humility and saying, we don't even have to lead the way. We just want to do. It's not even about getting the credit. It's about just participating. I think that sense of leading through humility can start to turn things around.
Thank you.
Can I jump in on that very quickly?
Please.
Because so Augustine, our wonderful African ancestor, said about the church that the church is, and he used a expletive word for a woman of somewhat loose morals, but she is also our mother. And so that, she's not that good, but she's also our mother.
Yeah.
And so that dichotomy that you have in the church. And one of the things I was thinking about earlier as I was going through some of my thoughts on this, when I look again to the South African experience, one of the roots of the problem with apartheid theology, which was the theological justification of apartheid ideology, and then the system of apartheid, was that it rested on a weak ecclesiology. Its understanding of the church was weak. And one of the things that all of these different, especially Ubuntu theology and Belhar confession would say in response is, we need the church to stand up and to tap into its own resources. And so Belhar, for example, would go back to the foundational belief, the confession of the Christian church that Jesus is Lord. And someone like Alan Bussack, one of the famous anti-apartheid theologians, he would speak about the lordship of Christ against the lordless powers of this world. It's an alternative vision that breaks through the kind of the prisons that we put around ourselves.
Thank you. I want to, I've got a bunch of questions for you all, and I thank you for that delving into Bosak. I want to get to some theology in a second again as well. But we got a question from the audience. Doug Nettleton asks, given Dr. Bard's comments, that number one, we cannot have faith without justice. Two, racism is grounded in economics. And three, the problem with apartheid is that it gave up on reconciliation. And four, that Ubuntu is about connectedness. Please comment on the American public education since Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 and the failed efforts to build Shalom in education because of white flight from public education, public health, in favor of privileged communities of economic separation. That was a long question, Doug. I'm sorry, but talk a little bit about that. Chris, do you want to start with that? I know it's based on Rachel's question, but because she's not indigenous here, let you start with it and let her pick up after that.
Certainly. So I just think about the ways in which we just have to operate in honesty. I think there's so much of a desire to wrap ourselves in the mythology of how we got here. And I think that there's so much that can be fixed or at least approached through the sense of being honest with ourselves about the history. Like we're seeing it now play out in real time, that folks who know and have seen what has happened when our children, the Gen Zers, the Generation Alphas, are starting to ask great questions about why are things the way they are. And they're really inquisitive and wanting to read historic texts. They want to read literacy. They really want to have this deeper understanding of our roots. And if we can really push through this pervasive sense of the mythology is the truth, this pervasive sense of just trying to gaslight an entire society, I do think that we will have a lot of opportunity to have progress, but it's really going to take people being honest with themselves and people not allowing people who are just like loud and wrong to just scream over them. I think it's really going to take that sense of advocating for the truth in the public square.
Amen. Thank you for that. Rachel?
The education system is probably the aspect of American society that most resembles apartheid South Africa. When I was growing up in a small mountain village, as in many small rural towns, there was a primary school, which is the first 7 years of schooling, for white kids and one for children of color, because the schools were segregated still at that time. But there was no high school for children of color, and they were not allowed to attend the white high school, which is the last 5 years of schooling in South Africa. I think more than anything else, that was what turned me against apartheid. Because as Professor Dirkie Smit, who is one of the people most involved with the Ballard Confession as well, as he once remarked, that the gravest injustice of apartheid was not the stuff that went before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes, those were obviously very serious injustices, actual killings of people and so on. But the broadest, most long-term injustices that as a society was created by this was that people who should have been doctors and engineers, and not that those jobs are always the best, but jobs that are necessary and that some people might be more inclined to want to do, that they are people who are just doing other kind of jobs that don't require qualification because they were never able to get the schooling needed to actually fulfill their potential and so on. And so that is what I see here. For me, the way in which schools are funded in the United States is the root of a lot of evil. The problem here, and this relates to the problem of economics and race, right? House prices are linked to this now. If you change it overnight, the economy collapses. So we are sitting in a bind. And I honestly, on a macro level, I don't know how that is solved, but that needs to be solved because the system as it is, as we all know, just perpetuates. I mean, this is just segregation. It is basically apartheid schooling. It's just not a name. So, and it's not just a matter of white flight, because you, in a certain sense, can't always blame parents if they want to put their children in good schools. The problem is that this is a systemic thing, right? The underneath the legal system that is creating this, the way that schools are allocated and what schools kids can attend, etc.
Thank you. Question from Reverend Janet Garner Mullins is if we can't have faith without a focus on justice, then the church will need a heart transplant, she says. How do we get the church to embrace both, not only preaching and teaching faith, but faith with action that relates to justice? I'll turn that over to you, Rachel.
Oh, to me. Okay. I think we need to understand that justice is what love for neighbor looks like. And so justice is not something separate from the Christian faith. The stuff is there in our tradition. It's there already in the basic teaching of Jesus Christ. What is the greatest law? To love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. You don't really need much more beyond that. But then if you actually go back into the tradition, I'm currently teaching a course called Theology and the Struggle for Justice for our public theology students. And the first week we looked at ancient documents of the church. We looked at Gregory of Nazianzus and Gregory of Nyssa. These are really, really old, long ago people. And they would talk about injustice against the poor and how the church needs to step in. They would talk about slavery and how can you enslave a person who carries within them the image of God. So we have the theological resources, but we often have an impoverished theology that is based just on me and my Jesus and how do I get a ticket to heaven. That is not Christianity, I'm sorry to say. That is a form of Gnostic theology. Gnostics were these people who believed that, the whole purpose of life is to have your soul escape the world.
Come on.
And by the way, atonement, right, which is the work of Christ, that's an embodied thing. I mean, the Christian faith does not believe in words. We believe in the word. We believe in a body that is speaking to us. And I don't think we often make enough of that. So this is the theologian getting all kind of theological here.
No. Thank you so much for that notion of embodied incarnate faith. Chris, I'm going to start you off with that, but I'll turn you over to this notion of how do we teach faith and then teach action at the same time? Is there a bifurcation, or is this notion of embodied faith the reality of the church? What do you think, Chris?
Oh, it's happening, and it needs to press into the coldest parts of, like, if we are the body, it needs to press into like the parts that like are still blue. You know what I mean? Like, we need to get the circulation going fully, because everything that Rachel's saying makes me think about the whole notion of praying with your feet, right? Like, in the book of James talks about faith without works is dead. Like, what does it mean for us to not just live our faith intellectually, or live our faith in a very like self-help sort of understanding of, like, Jesus is my ATM, my genie, and my homeboy. Like, we got to get beyond all of that to really understanding what does it mean for us to model the ways in which we live in the teachings of Jesus. And that has to look like, and this is where, if the theologian has going to come out for you, Rachel, the abolitionist has to come out for me, that whole sense of having our focus be toward the least of me, being toward the margins. Like, it astounds me how few churches in this day have prison ministries that are active, right? At what point did we decide that serving those who are incarcerated, serving those who are experiencing homelessness is an elective? Like, at what point did we decide that it's okay for us to sort of just like write a check only and then wash our hands of it? No, it's about that the whole sense of being embodied also brings us towards an understanding of what it means to have immanence and really doing life with people, and not just looking as if, oh, I'm good enough to just write a check for you, but I don't actually want to serve you. And I think we have to get back into living that sense, not just for the sake of those whom we are serving, but also understanding that the excesses that we enjoy are built on exploitation, and we have to free ourselves from that exploitation.
But we need to free ourselves from the exploitation. We are just about at time, and I hate to do that. I hate to close us down. So please, Aaron, give us another couple minutes just to make sure that we can close out effectively. I just want to end with this question, a simple question. So we've got people that are people of faith in faith communities. What can they begin to do to work for Shalom in their own context? Chris?
The work of Shalom, in my estimation, starts with confession. I write about, and I talk about confession being the start. So it can't just be something where you want to experience peace and turn peace into a commodity, but it has to start with understanding that there was a wound done, whether it's one that I inherited or one that I've done with my own hands, that I need to really, at the very least, acknowledge its existence. It sounds very silly or trite to someone who's like, we need so much more than that, but we have to understand the state of affairs is that we have a, a large swath of people who are acting as if the injury never occurred in the first place. It's a matter of fact that they were the ones who were injured by you mentioning the injury. And I think that we have to get to a point where we acknowledge that the harm that we've benefited from, the harm that we participate in, and interrupt that. Then we can start to talk about building towards shalom, because without that, you aren't actually doing just peace. You're just trying to tell people to be quiet.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for being with us today. I know that you'll speak again in a second about a program that's coming up, but I just want to say thank you so much for being here, sharing your wisdom, your insight, your brilliance with us today, Chris.
Thank you.
Rachel, let me turn it over to you. What do people in congregations, what do they do to move towards shalom?
I would actually agree with Chris on the confession thing, but I would flip it around a bit, because I think confession comes with engagement. It starts with engagement. And this is a typical kind of praxis theology. We don't know what it is that we need to confess until we have engaged others. And so I think cultivating a spirituality of courage. I'm a big fan of the German theologian Paul Tillich, who wrote a book called The Courage to Be. Well, I think we need some of that. Cultivating without expecting perfection of yourself, but diving in and learning and being open, and in the process learning what it is that needs to be confessed, what it is that needs to be engaged with. So engage in the difficult work, have some courage.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Rachel, for your brilliance, for your experience in South Africa, for tying it to America. I think that I'm still dumbfounded by your assessment of America as a person coming from South Africa when you got here, and how that convicts us in our context in significant ways. This notion of confession is central, but confession with engagement and confession informed by engagement. I love the way that you two have tied this up. We need to move toward shalom society. We need to move toward shalom church. And in essence, this won't be done until we can admit that we have caused the wound. And we begin to do the kind of work that we need to do to know that there is a wound and begin to work towards healing it. Grateful for this conversation today. Grateful for all of you for joining us. This was going to be the beginning of a year-long series, and we'll talk about several different issues as we go. But before we do that, I want to turn it over to Chris to give us some insight into an upcoming program.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So here at Union Presbyterian Seminary, our Leadership Institute has a new series of book clubs. We're going to be starting with the Theopoetics Book Club, where we will read Terraform, Building a Better World by Propaganda. Reverend Dr. D'Angelo Dia will be leading that. This is a collection of essays, poetry. It's really going to help us understand what it looks like, and really building off of this conversation that we've had this evening, what it looks like for us to not only talk about a better world, but really doing the hands and feet part of building it out together. It's going to meet on Wednesday nights all throughout October from 7 to 9 Eastern time. You can register at upsem.edu/leadership-institute. You'll see a variety of the different book clubs that are there, and you'll also have access to a recorded workshop once you register, led by Reverend Dr. D'Angelo Dia. Cannot wait for these book clubs to start. Really, really excited about Theopoetics, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. So thank you in advance for signing up and being a part of this book club.
Amen. Amen. I just want to say thank you, Chris and Dia, working together. Dia is one of the most brilliant minds out there, and his engagement with Theopoetics will be inspirational for you. I think that the work that he has done in justice manifest as Theopoetics is remarkable. We could all learn a great deal from him. I want to invite you to a few events, and the first of them is to come back next month and join us for our next Dangerous Dialogue. When we come together next month, we're going to talk about LGBTQIA+ youth, them struggling with issues of homelessness, and how we can do justice, how we can seek shalom for this community in particular. But we would be remiss if we did not let you know about a major event that's coming up this next month. Our new president, Jack Lapsley, before she was president of Union Presbyterian Seminary, was the dean of Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey. And while she was there at Princeton, she helped lead a process, a slavery audit there that began to help people understand that there was an institutional obligation to do something about the racial injustice that she saw. She's going to talk a little bit about that program here with us at Union Presbyterian Seminary on Monday, October the 9th. That will be at 7 p.m. It will be live at Sharon Presbyterian Church here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I would invite anybody that's in the area to join us on that night in person. If you are from a distance, we will also broadcast that, so you'll have access to that as well. Then on Tuesday, October the 10th, at 11:30 a.m., we're going to have a luncheon. I want to introduce Jack to the local clergy and religious leaders, faith community in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you have the ability to come on that day, we want to invite you to participate in this event. I'm sure this will be wonderful, rich, engaging, and will give you an opportunity to see some of the wonderful and innovative things that are coming out of Union Presbyterian Seminary. So please know that we're just beginning. And also, I'd always invite you back for our Just Talk, Talk Just series as well. We got a lot going on at Union Presbyterian Seminary. We're taking seriously the work of justice and the work of race, moving towards reconciliation. The only way to do that is to seek shalom. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. God bless you all.